So the final message being, if you don't want to be recorded throughout this session, please just keep your questions in the Q&A section or the comment box, and I will get to them at the very, very end. So let's get started. So hi, I'm Charlotte Dacre. I'm the Ancient Woodland Inventory Officer for Wiltshire, and I'm very excited tonight because we're going to be talking about one of my favourite topics, which is wildflowers. It's a perfect time of year for them. It looks like it's going to rain right now, but I promise you, hopefully you'll see some absolutely stunning and picturesque flora this year. But before we go straight into that, let's talk about some of the families. So please excuse me. So what is the Ancient Woodland Inventory Update? I just introduced that I'm an officer, so what's that all about? My apologies for any of my volunteers here. This will be the 6th or 7th time you've heard this conversation. My sincerest apologies. So it's a national-led project by Natural England. There will be a Ancient Woodland officer or team of officers per county or parish. I happen to be the one for Wiltshire and Swindon area. The original inventory, or just the AWI, was first introduced in the 1980s, and I like to say it put Britain quite literally on the map for woodland conservation. It was a very, very exciting time. We originally put the project, I say I wasn't born back then, but they originally put the project together to basically look more in depth at woodland conservation. It was kind of the first time that we were using computer mapping as well. So that was coming into this infancy, which meant that a lot of the teams of ecologists that went out for the original inventory had to do everything by hand. So that's looking at historical records by hand and not being able to digitize them, and then comparing them to the biological data they've collected, and obviously sending letters and briefly emailing a couple of organizations that might be relevant to the project. So I can't imagine what that must have been like. I'm very, very privileged, spoiled even, to have some of the systems that we have today, which make my life a whole lot easier. So the process is basically, as just mentioned, we go out and collect biological data. The data that we're interested in is specifically botanical. So for that, I'm talking about the ancient woodland indicator species, and then we are also comparing that to historical data of any woodland or wooded pasture. So that also includes woodland, pasture, and parkland that predates the 1600s. The Wiltshire and Swindon History Centre have been an absolutely humongous help with this process. The way that they've been able to store and collect that data over time has been remarkable, and I feel so privileged to be able to view those records. It is a free service. If you're in Wiltshire and you want to go and see some of the cool maps that I'm referring to, I would definitely go check them out. But enough nerding about maps, let's get back onto the project. So we are hoping there are basically initially 4 phases. Phase 1 and 2 is all about reviewing the original data and then comparing it to what we have. In our original ancient woodland inventory, it was estimated that we about had 1,100 parcels of potentially long-lasting ancient woodland. A lot of terminology, don't worry about it. My predecessor, Ewan Mackenzie, he worked quite closely with the data in the comparison of things, and of course our metrics for what we are looking for in the update are quite different to the original inventory. So for example, the original inventory excluded any parcels of woodland which were under 2 hectares. And we obviously know today from the scientific literature that we can review that some of those parcels are fragmented woodland, and they could potentially be ancient, so they definitely need to be investigated. So that's been included this time around. And our terminology when we came to woodland back then was very different to what we know of it today. So when they were looking at woodlands back in the 1980s, they were thinking of those characteristic woodlands, kind of like, oh, the one behind me, great wood. Whereas nowadays, we also want to include things like woodland park and pasture. So a good example of that would be Stourhead, for example. You've got those really beautiful historic buildings, and then kind of more of an open scenery, and then these big, massive ancient tree trunks, which is something that people often ask me. One moment. So that is me and the image about this time last year. That is on some chalk downland, and then directly behind me with the woodland pasture. And funny enough, I'm actually going to be speaking about primroses later on. And I was hoping that from that particular survey, I'd captured a photo of a primrose to show you guys, specifically cowslip. I didn't, but there were loads and loads on that verge. But that's basically what I get to do. I go out as an ecologist, review the woodlands, collect the biological data, specifically ancient woodland indicator species, and then compare it to maps. Do we have any questions for that to start off with? I will just give you guys a moment. Just to let you guys know, we are currently on phase 3, which is the collecting and comparing data stage, if I hadn't made that clear enough. And then phase 4 is the more analytical stage and report writing, and the submission, which hopefully will be in March 2025. We're currently in the survey season as we speak. It lasts up until September. And then it will be basically collected by Natural England to be used more as a conservation management tool. So I can't promise that any legislative change is going to come from this particular data set, but I can let you know it's going to be incredibly helpful for future conservation projects. So it is definitely worth the hype, in my opinion. So now let's get straight into what you guys are really here today to talk about, and that is wildflowers. So what are wildflowers and why are they so important to us? So we all have a different definition of what we would think of as a wildflower. My mum, for example, sees them as weeds or undesirable plants, whereas I see them as wildflowers. I have a wildflower patch in my garden, currently speaking, and my family members are like, are you gonna trim some of that back? And I'm like, no, that defeats the purpose. So I thought that this was a really, really good definition in the ecology world, and it's definitely one that we refer back to quite frequently, is a plant indigenous, so native to the country or region, including plants naturalized predating the 1500s. The reason why this particular definition is so important to me is because a lot of the data that I'm referring to, historically and biologically speaking, predates the 1600s. So being able to know that some of the plants we're looking at today are relatives of those predating the 1500s gives us a more accurate representation of our ancient woodlands. So that was by Preston 2004, 20 years ago, but it still stays quite true to this date. So I was throughout some of my wildflower research, I did unfortunately hit a lot of bad news, as I'm sure that you guys are more than aware of. So I'm trying to keep the bad stuff to a minimal so we can focus on the good. But we have, unfortunately, since the 1930s, lost 97% of our natural wildflower meadows. Now, that doesn't mean they can't be restored, and that doesn't mean that we can't plant wildflower meadows. It just means that, unfortunately, 97% of the UK's natural wildflower meadows have been declining. And that was actually taken by an article written by Chelsea Phillips on Make Your Own Wildflower Meadow. I would definitely check it out, but it's on Wiltshire Wildlife Trust blog, so I do highly recommend checking that one out. But it is very, very sad to read, as that's kind of the statement title. And the reason why I wanted to talk about wildflowers in relation to ancient woodlands today is because there is quite a lot of crossover, specifically because according to BSBI anyway, we have one of the most extensive and richest chalk grassland in the country, and that's nothing to take lightly. That's very, very positive and very serious, and we get to see a lot of beautiful flowers that in some places around the other parts of this country you wouldn't necessarily get to see, definitely on the chalk downlands. And I have some reserves in the back of my mind for anyone interested and wants to go and see some of those plants for themselves. So we are going to be talking about several different families. I've tried to keep the scientific jargon to a minimal because I know that it can be quite discouraging and overwhelming. And I have put in a couple of things that have helped me remember things when it comes to identification, but we all work differently. So if it doesn't work for you, we can definitely talk about that at the end and maybe find a different way of learning about wildflower families, because it's a really, really interesting topic in itself, but it's also really, really beneficial when not just looking at biological data, but when reading literature and things like that. And when you look at guides. I know that some people really struggle with the Francis Road Key, which is a phenomenal book if you know how to use it, and because of scientific jargon, it often puts people off. So I really have tried to keep this to a minimum, but if at any point you think it's a bit too much, do let me know and we can have a chat at the end. So the first one, and by the way, I will not pronounce any of these names correctly. I will try my best. I have YouTubed them all day trying to learn how to pronounce them, but fingers crossed I get them right. So the first one is the carrot family. I'm going to try and say it as Apiaceae? Apiaceae. I think that's correct. Anyway, so they're also known as the umbellifer family. So they have these really cute looking umbrellas. Is a flower going to turn up? Yay! Here is my wild carrot picture from last year. It has this really, really beautiful like pink dot in the central there. And as you can see at the very borders of the flower for wild carrot, they are a bit irregular, the flowers, and that's actually a really good key characteristic when trying to identify individuals from this family. One moment. Now, usually members from this family are found, I like to think, on any sort of ground that has been recently disturbed. So like roadside verges, plant meadows, on the edges of farmland or farmland wildflower meadows, field margins, anything that would be considered as like excess environmental kind of ground disturbance areas. So if, for example, you walk your dog a lot in a particular field and out of nowhere loads of hogweeds grow, it's because the ground's been disturbed, and that's kind of what gets them to go to those kinds of places. So those are they're like preferable habitat types, but there are many different species that have very specific habitat types as well. So I am trying to keep this very general and broad. So do take some of what I say with a pinch of salt, because it might not necessarily apply to all species in that particular family. So the first characteristic that often gets my head in the right place when trying to identify a member of the carrot family is the compound umbel, or the florets that resemble umbrellas. So this is what they're specifically recognized by. So what happens is the flowers, I don't know how well you can see on this image, hopefully it's quite clear for you guys, but the flowers connect to the secondary bracts, or the bractlets, and then they connect to the primary bractlets, all from one specific place, and that's where they all kind of grow from. So in the UK, members of the carrot family are rarely shrubs. They're usually just plants in their own right. But of course, when they get quite densely packed together, it can sort of resemble shrubs, if that makes any sense. Think like on the side of a riverbank, when you get quite a lot of cow's parsley, for example, growing there. It looks kind of shrubby, but it's not. They're all individual plants. It's very rare that they do actually occur as shrubs. But they are actual annual or perennial herbs. So the leaves are usually alternate. So I've tried to include an image on the very left here of the leaf. You can see it doesn't necessarily become opposite pairs. It is alternate from one another. And the petals of each flower are even, although for some you can spot an enlarged petal on the outside. A lot of the members of Apiaceae is white in coloration, but that's not necessarily the standard. Some of them can have more like a pinkish hue or very baby-like pink kind of coloration. That's kind of why I've included the example of the carrot family here, because you can see it has a pink flower in the center, which might throw you off, but then they have those uneven, irregular petals on the outside that immediately let you know it's a member of the carrot family. Hopefully that has all made sense so far. Do we have any questions for the moment? Okay, we shall move on. The next family I wanted to talk about is the daisy family, because for me, this was a really, really easy one to learn. Daisies are all around us, so definitely one that people would consider a weed. And a lot of people don't realize that many different plants fall into this category. So there are more than 20,000 species in this family, and it is considered the UK's largest wildflower group. Now you can probably see on the left there is a spear thistle, and you're like, Charlotte's got that wrong. They are not in the same family, but they are in the same family, and it's all to do with the actual florets. and where they stem from and how they grow and how they develop in this family. And that's kind of one of the key characteristics. So if they, just because it looks thorny and it's a different color, it doesn't necessarily mean it's not relevant to that family. So this can include things like the example here that I've included, where it's more on the anatomical side. Sorry, is actually of a sunflower, and then you have a spear thistle, and then I also wanted to remind everyone things like obviously daisies themselves and aster plants that you can buy from the garden centre, all arrange from this specific family. So it is often considered a weed in gardens, which often means that if you have a garden quite close to an ancient woodland, for example, that's how we get those garden escapes. For most British members of this family, they actually have the tiny florets cluster together to make the flower. Tiny florets, for example, let's use the example of a daisy. In the center here on the diagram, we have a disc floret. So those discs are the tiny little yellow nodules you can kind of see in the center of a daisy. And then surrounding it is a marginal floret, which kind of is those white petals in themselves. And that would what would make a daisy. But the really interesting thing about it is that there are 3 different types. So we have tubular, ray, and disc. So for daisies, there would be ray and disc florets, but for sunflowers it is just one, or it is a combination of 2 out of the 3 or 3 of the 3, which is really interesting. And each floret consists of an inferior ovary. So inferior, when we talk about inferior ovaries in terms of flowers, means that they are below the other parts of the plant that make the flower, if that makes any sense. So I've tried to include it in this image at the very bottom between the disc floret and the marginal floret. You are just above the lateral view. You can see where the ovaries are. And then depending on the type of floret you have, the different organs then on top protect it. I hope that's making sense. If we don't have any questions about the daisy family, I am going to move on. I just thought it was a really nice, simple, easy family to include because they're around us all the time. They're often considered a weed. That includes your dandelions, your thistles, your daisies, your sunflowers. You can find them almost anywhere. And so being able to examine them and the different floret styles they have can be very, very helpful for distinguishing between 2 completely different species and 2 different families. So I'm not even going to begin to try and pronounce the scientific name for this family. So we're going to stick to the pinks. Okay. I wouldn't be able to, in my right mind, have a wildflower webinar without including the pinks. As you probably could see, I don't know how well you could have seen in the advertisement, but I did use a red campion, and it was also the background for the first slide. So it would be completely unfair of me to not include that particular family. I definitely didn't have any ulterior motives with the red campion being recognized as an ancient woodland indicator species or anything. So I thought I would include some of the anatomical photos for this as well. A lot of the diagrams that I'm including are not my own, but I do have some recommendations on where you can view them. So if the lettering here is a little bit tiny or too small for you, do let me know, because I'm more than happy to send you the image directly, and I give full credit to the particular authors. The reason that I wanted to include some of the diagrams from the left here by Limount and Dacre in 1876 is because it's one of the oldest botanical references we have of hand-drawn images for many different families, and so they were a consistent reference that kept coming out throughout my research, and a lot of their work has been photographed or photocopied, sorry, and then uploaded for free online, so you can actually review a lot of their different anatomical drawings of different flora online for free. So I do recommend that as well. But so I wanted to include a couple of those because they're very, very detailed, but they're also not overwhelming, if that makes any sense. So let's talk a little bit about the pinks family, or the campion family. It also includes chickweeds and stitchwort. So above here, I've got the greater stitchwort just here. It's a really, really pretty flower. I'm going to give you some really poor advice, and I don't expect you to apply it to every flower you see. But for me personally, if it has 5 petals that have quite a deep lobed heart, in my head, I automatically think the pinks family. You might previously, when you're looking at different references, know it as the Elecbracia family, and obviously now it has been changed, and I believed it was changed in the 2000s, but I cannot give you a specific date on that, I'm afraid. The family consists of annuals and perennials, and the leaves are usually opposite in alternating pairs. Just making sure everyone's all right in the chat. The leaves are usually in opposite and alternating pairs and are often characterized as like long and simple. So as mentioned before, one of the species that I am looking for in Wiltshire is the red campion, because they are associated with ancient woodlands. And I often get the comment when I'm out and about with volunteers of, well, it's not really red, is it? It's pink. And I'm like, I didn't name it. I'm so sorry, I didn't name that one. I didn't name any of them. So, but they also do have the white variations. Do we have any questions on the pinks family for the moment? Just give me one moment. I just want to make sure to see if Andrew and Sally can log on for us. I haven't got any more feedback from them, so I am going to move on. Do we have any questions before I do? Hopefully everything's making sense and I'm not just babbling on. Okay, cool. We're going to move on. One of my favorite families of all time, and also to discuss, is the geranium family. So the first like plant I ever grew was a herb robert. It's also currently growing in my garden. So this image in the center here was, I'm so sorry, it was taken today. I finally burped, yay. But I wanted to include a couple of different examples for this one. So we do have the shiny geranium. They kind of have the more palmate leaves. So I like to think of them as they're kind of similar to Canadian leaves if they didn't have the gaps in between them, if that makes any sense. They're kind of like little clouds, little bubbles. Or you get pinnet leaves, which are the one that Herb Robert is presenting in the center here. So again, I've included the photocopied reference from Le Mount and Dacre. I'm never going to be able to pronounce that right, but I know you guys know what I'm referring to. So there are reported to be over 400 species in the UK alone, which is a lot of species. And it's the geranium family is also known as the cranesbill family. So if you don't know it's the geranium family, you might know it as a cranesbill family, but geranium is technically in the name with the Geraniaceae. So the flowers are usually very vibrant, usually very showy. And they kind of range from anything from white to pink to red to violet, but they're also quite small, in my opinion. They're not kind of in the same sort of category as the sunflower, and they usually aren't really much bigger than, I would say, a child's fist. I don't know if that's a good size measurement reference, but hopefully you guys know what I'm referring to. So the flowers are irregular, sorry, and they have 5 petals and 5 sepals. So sepals, I like to tell people, are kind of like the support backing for the petals, if that makes any sense. If you were to turn a petal over, you would see like a green-like structure behind it. That's usually the sepals, and they are a part in their own right. But it's quite good if you count 5 petals and you can count 5 sepals, and they kind of look something like from the geranium family. You might have something from the geranium family. The alternate leaves, so they alternate leaves, sorry, so that means that they're not on opposite pairs. And they can either be geranium or they can either be pinnate or palmate, sorry. We are skipping ahead. My apologies for that one. In my experience for Wiltshire species, they're usually hairy or velvet to the touch, quite soft. But that's not always, so I wouldn't necessarily rely on that as an identification characteristic. And the fruits are produced from these little pods. I don't know how well you can see it, but if you look to the left image, next to the top pink flower, that has, oh, why is it doing that? I'm so sorry. It's because I'm clicking on it, you see. It has a pod with kind of like a long stem, and inside there is where the seed develops. which is really, really interesting. So I believe they are a dry seed and it's one per pod, which is quite cool. I might have that incorrect. My apologies if I do. I'll send out a note if I have. Do we have any questions on the geranium family? I think they're phenomenal, personally. I think they're really, really cool. You often do find them again at disturbed sites, anywhere with disturbed soil, or in those wildflower packs that you can buy and plant. They usually pop up then. So, in more damp and darkened woodlands, you can find them more under things like shrubs or dense foliage. They're often there as well. So sometimes you do have to get your eye in to look for them. Red campion does have a very not campion, sorry, herb robert does have quite a varied amount of, it does really vary from environment to environment, to habitat. So I have found them, for example, on like riversides, river bedsides, and then I've also found them in really, really densely packed woodland, and then I found them in open spaces like my garden, for example, that has plenty of reason to get straight to the light. So it's really interesting that they can vary so much just in one plant alone. Really, we could do an entire deep dive just into the geranium family itself, especially this time of year, because there are so many different ones. So obviously, if you didn't already know, hopefully you kind of got the gist of it. But if you didn't know, the cranesbills is called cranesbills because it have those really the long little snouts. They're great for pollinators. They're fantastic. If we don't have any questions, I'm gonna move on. I hope that's okay. This is a family that I often get laughed at a little bit when I talk about them. So the mint or the nettle family, and you'll probably have started to guess on the screen why I get laughed at. It's definitely the dragon. We'll come back to that. So it was formerly known as the Libatiae family, and now it's the Laminaceae family. There's over 7,000 species globally. I do not know the count for UK or Wiltshire at this time, but I can probably find out. So it's home to mint, thyme, lavender, dead nettles, regular nettles, self-heal, for example, which is the image that I've included there. And they are often usually annuals, periannuals. They can sometimes appear in small shrubs as well, but it does depend on species. And when I say small, I mean dwarf, like tiny shrubs. You wouldn't necessarily call it a shrub if you were just viewing it for the first time, if that makes any sense. They're often identified using their very, very distinctive stem. The cool thing about their stem, if you've ever found one, I do not recommend doing this with a nettle, but if you find like something like a self-heal, they're often in like graveyards or on disturbed ground. Believe it or not, quite a lot of wildflowers like those kind of characteristics. Anyway, if you find a self-heal and you pick it, I don't always recommend picking plants. Do not pick them without protection. But if you rub the stem between your fingers, it won't feel like four corners, but it will have four sides. So the corners are obviously because it sells. It's not going to be like a hard corner, is it? But you can feel the four sides, and though that's one of their leading characteristics for identification is their square stem. That's where they get the name from. So if you ever cut it in half, you can see it has four different edges, which I think is very, very cool. A lot of the time they have like hairs or spines on them. They're quite delicate. I wanted to include what was my first ever sighting of a yellow archangel for this example. We'll get back to the dragon in a minute, don't worry, it's all going to tie back round. So the yellow archangel is an ancient woodland indicator species, and it is a species that the Wiltshire Botanical Society is interested in recording. So if you see one, please let me or them know. We really, really would appreciate it, and they're just fantastic in their own right. They do sometimes get mixed up with white dead nettle because of the size and the coloration, but you will know if you see a yellow archangel. It's usually quite prominent, again, in ancient woodlands, more dense canopy. If you see quite a lot of bluebells, you can find it there as well, near oak trees and things like that. This is my first time. I have so many photos on my phones of just yellow archangel from this particular site visit. It was absolutely fantastic. But the reason the dragon's there, don't worry, the reason I get laughed at is because to me, they look like dragon snap heads. Like if you were to take both lobes, because they usually have double lobes per flower, and you were to put them together, they look like little dragon heads. So that's how my mind remembers the mint family. If they have something similar to a dragon head, you're probably, you know, in the right ballpark. So I thought that was a really, really fun thing to include there. I don't know if it's helpful for anyone else, but that's how I've remembered it for the entirety of my career so far. And the really cool thing about it is that each flower is irregular, so they don't necessarily, they're not copies of one another. They do look different, and they all wrap around a particular point on the axis. This creates a whorl. Think of like whirlpools, like it goes round. So you'll have a stem, and then you'll have a flower on each side, on all four edges technically. And it looks like a circle from above, like a whorl. So that's really, really interesting about them as well. So you do have to be careful with the identification process, not only because nettles, if you do find stinger nettles, they sting, but also because if you look at the flowers themselves, I don't know how well you can see it, but some of them grow under the leaves as well. And so that can throw people off when it comes to their identification, is that they think that because of the positioning of the heads, they're not growing in like a whorl circulation all the way up. They just look as if there's flower, leaves, flower, leaves. So that can often throw people off. So it's a good, I didn't get a perspective from above, you know, I got like loads of photos of the yellow archangel. But it is good to look from above when reviewing them, and then also from the side, and get from different angles to be able to see where each of the flowers are growing from, because they can be overshadowed by the leaves. And I kind of try to include that next to the dragon on the left hand side here. If you look towards the bottom, the very, very large leaf at the end that looks like it would hurt you, but it's not going to. There are tiny little yellow dragon heads growing underneath. So don't be thrown off if you see that on your first kind of mint identification. Do we have any questions about the Lamiaceae family so far? It's okay if you just want to laugh at me because of my dragon head references. Time is cracking on, isn't it? Right. We will move on for the moment. By the way, if I get anything wrong throughout this presentation, or you've got another little bit of tidbit information that you think will be really helpful for someone else, please do just let me know. At the end of the day, whatever helps you learn and memorize different families is worth knowing. So even if it is just a silly gimmick like what I've used with the dragon heads, if it gets it into your mind how to associate different flowers with different families, that's all that matters to me personally. So if you have any tips or tricks, or you're like, actually, Charlotte, you were wrong about this, please do let me know. I do genuinely really appreciate it. I love being wrong because it's a great learning opportunity. So do let me know. But moving on for the moment, we're now going to talk about the mallow family. Mallows are very popular with pollinators. You've probably seen them quite frequently, more on the outskirts or open areas of a woodland, so like along the pathways. They kind of prefer more bright rather than shady spots, but that's not necessarily true across the whole family. So I'm so sorry, this is a great diagram, sorry, by Thomas here. It has all the different patterns of what you would expect to find in a mallow. So mallows do resemble some of the other flowers we've already reviewed earlier on. The way that I remember mallows is because they smell quite florally, they're quite light in fragrance, and their colorations are quite limited. It's usually from white to light pinks. Although dark pinks and mauves are known. That's for example, mallow, the translation for Greek, it means soft. But then mallow, the translation for French, means mauve. So it's really interesting trying to look at the how we've got to the label of this particular family today. So it's the shade range when it comes to the flowers is more limited in comparison to some of the others that also have 5 flowers. And the dent in the top, do you remember earlier I was talking about with the chickweed families, that they have quite dense divots in the petals? so they look more like hearts. These kind of look like hearts if you weren't trying, and a lot of the time the edges are much smoother, and the dense is not the right word, but I'm going to use it. The divots are much shallower, shall we say. And so those are really, really good identification features. Mallows are not my strong suit when it comes to identification. So as you see here with the image I've included, again from Great Wood, it's likely to be a musk mallow. I'm not 100%, and it's absolutely okay that I'm not. My suggestion to all of you, if you were to take away one piece of advice from tonight's webinar, would be, if you don't know, don't say. If you don't know the specific species, take it to the family. If you don't know the family, take it above, so that you're not necessarily misidentifying things in areas where it's not actually present and you're not getting that species completely wrong. It's absolutely okay to not know and to take lots of reference photos to review at another time. Unfortunately, I was a bit of a rush this day, but I literally snapped it and ran. So I don't have too many reference photos for this particular mallow, but it's a very pretty photo, so I thought, why not include it? It is more likely to be a musk mallow than anything else, in my opinion, based on the characteristics, which we shall actually get talking into now. So it can grow as herbs or shrubs, which is really interesting. So the shrubs tend to be quite small, but not dwarf small. They're often vibrant shades. So the flowers are either formed in racemes, which are like flower clusters, is the best way to put it. But each flower has its own stalk that is equal length to the next flower that then connects to the same stem. So they all have their own stalks of equal size, and they're the flowers on top, and they all connect to one point on the stem. I hope that's making sense. I tried to include that photo as well, because it's a really good example of how they're connecting to the stem. You can see that they're not all divided from one place, kind of like the umbellifers. Instead, they are all coming from a singular point, but with their own stems. I hope that's made sense. I hope I didn't just confuse it even more for you guys. There are 5 petals, and each petal is then supported by a sepal. A lot of people want to say sepal, it's sepals per flower. And at least in my experience, the leaves can vary quite significantly. So that's kind of more when you're getting down to the identification of the species. But they are hairy. So that's one really good thing you can remember about the mallows, is if you see something really big, beautiful that bees are attracted to, lightly fragranced, and the stems and leaves are hairy, you're probably in the right ballpark for a mallow. The really, really fun thing that I wanted to include about this, though, is that the fruits that are stored in the capsules are called nutlets. Isn't that like the best word you've ever heard? Because they're not technically seeds, and they're not necessarily nuts, they're just nutlets. Sometimes I really do love the scientific community. I thought that was a great name. I found that out today, actually. I thought everyone's gonna be so excited about this, but I think I'm the only one really excited about it. Does anybody have any questions about the mallow family? Webinars always feel a bit strange because I am talking to people, but I'm not, if that makes any sense. It feels like I'm sometimes talking to myself. We're going to move on then to the very last family in this particular very whistle-stop tour webinar, which is the primrose family. I wanted to include them because they vary significantly between species, but also because they're common and they tie into the ancient woodland inventory update. So primroses here, in the one in the center that was taken by myself, that is the Primula vulgaris. So that would be what you would associate as the common primrose, not necessarily a garden escape. I'm talking wild common primrose with the basal rosette leaves that kind of resemble cabbage. One of the first. They're definitely a big, big sign of spring. That's what we associate them with in this country, and Wiltshire is no exception. They're a huge sign of spring, that spring is coming. It's one of the first flowers you're likely to see in bloom, especially if we've had quite a mild winter. And it's also one of the first flowers to show up in ancient woodlands. So they are a great indicator of ancient woodlands. The coloration is very specific though for wild primroses. It does really only stay in that white yellowy kind of color palette. It doesn't vary off to the beautiful pinks and purples that we can purchase at garden centers today. You'll know if you've seen a wild primrose, sorry, because it has a very simple color palette in comparison to what you would necessarily see in your garden. But the other really cool thing about it is that the way the flowers are presented can vary quite significantly, as well as their leaves. So don't always associate those basil all coming from one spot, wrinkly, cabbagey leaves as being primrose, because they actually have a huge variation. And if you have I don't know if my camera's going to pick it up, my sincerest apologies. If you do have the Collins British Common Wildflower Guide, it goes into great detail about the different types of primroses or members of the primrose family. It's kind of odd because it's the primrose family, but the main one that we see, the primrose, is called primrose. So it can sometimes get unnecessarily complicated in my mind, at least. So they are herbaceous. They are usually a family of annuals and perennials. The leaves are simple, as mentioned, but they do vary greatly between species. They are very important for Wiltshire, again, because they are associated with ancient woodlands. You're likely to find primroses in ancient woodlands, and then cowslips, which is an illustrated picture there by a German botanist in the 1885 of cowslips. It's now, the name has been changed over time, but we'll get into that another time. But it is a cowslip is what I'm trying to get at. They look very, very different, but you're likely to find cowslips more in grassland meadows and on chalkland verges, kind of like that photo I showed you at the very beginning where I'm surveying and I didn't take any photos of them. But then next to it, directly next to it, was an ancient woodland site. So they're not, cowslips and other species aren't necessarily in the ancient woodlands themselves, but they are adjacent in they are usually found adjacent in like surrounding habitats, if that makes any sense. They are a very, very cool one. And again, we have another excellent drawing of a very limited perspective of what could be found with the primrose family here, again by I want to say it's Lemieux, and from the guys in 1876. They did a great job. It's definitely a book that I would recommend reading, if, well, not reading, but reviewing if you had the time. Do we have any questions on our last family of the night, the Primulaceae, or the primrose family? I do have multiple drinks, by the way, don't worry. I get very thirsty talking. If we don't have any questions, we're just going to get into the last couple of slides of the night, and then you can all go and enjoy your lovely evenings. I hope you're doing something very relaxing on this Tuesday night. I'm going to touch on this very slightly. It's something that is very, very important to me, but I know can seem a little daunting and maybe even boring to others. But I'm hosted by, the Wiltshire and Swindon Biological Record Centre, which in turn is hosted by Wiltshire Wildlife Trust. So collecting records and analysing that data is something that's really, really important for us, especially for the Ancient Woodland Inventory update. So if you did want to collect records, but not necessarily in relation to this project, there's a whole world of different ways you can do it, but it can seem overwhelming. The first place that people return to and are recommended to actually turn to is iRecord. I personally struggle with the structure and the format of iRecord, but just because it doesn't work for me, and it doesn't mean it won't work for you. So if you do have time this evening, just go on their website or download their app, because they are slightly different. But I do recommend checking out iRecord, and it's that dragonfly logo that you can see at the top there next to the title. Excuse me, just adjusting. That's how you know that you're on the right site. I had a lot of feedback from colleagues and friends saying that they found that app incredibly useful, but for myself, it's just something I really struggled to get my head around. The Biological Recording Company by Kieran Brown as well does quite a lot of webinars at very low price or often free on how to record. So if that's something you're interested in learning more about, I would definitely recommend attending one of those. I haven't included the resources for that. I'm so sorry, but I'm happy to pop it in the chat for anyone who's interested. If you have multiple records of plants that you found around your area or your garden or an ancient woodland, you can either, I recommend you submitting them to Richard or Kat at the Wiltshire Botanical Society, or you can always pass them on to me to directly email them, because I am also a member of the Wiltshire Botanical Society. So don't be afraid to just send me your records, and I can always go over how to format them with you, and then we can send them to the Wiltshire Botanical Society. But on their website, actually, they do have an entire page about recording and how to make the most out of your records. Basically, it's very, very user friendly and informative and simple to use, in my opinion. So I do recommend checking them out. If you're not from Wiltshire, I definitely recommend contacting your local county recorder, and you can actually find that again on the BSBI's website. So each county or parish will have their own recorder for their area that's kind of like a specialist. For example, Richard is ours as it stands alongside Kat, but I can't speak on other counties, but I'm more than happy to go through them if you're interested for your local area, and we can help you find one together. So don't be afraid to speak out about that. If you did want to submit your records directly to the Wiltshire and Swindon Biological Record Centre, you're more than welcome to. There are a couple of different ways that you can do that. We do have an entire page about that on our website. We have Excel spreadsheets that are formatted to be, they're very comprehensive in my opinion, but I'm obviously biased. And I've been using them for a long time. So I actually got my start in the record centre when I was 17. I'm now 26. And those were the record sheets that I was using back then before I had any ecological training at all. So they are very, very user friendly. If a 17-year-old Charlotte can do it, you can do it. So I highly recommend checking that out. But you can also, again, if you're not from the area and you're just popping in to say hello, or you're viewing this on YouTube right now, you can also contact your local environmental record centre, or the LURC, as we call it. Because sometimes they're biological recording centres and sometimes they're environmental recording centres, but we all are under the ALERC kind of status, if that makes any sense. I would definitely check out different areas that you can find them, because it does vary between county, but it doesn't vary between like town or city or anything like that. It is at the county level. So hopefully I've included all the information you need for recording for Wiltshire. But if you did have a different county that you wanted to focus on, or you're not from here, or you're going somewhere else on holiday but you still want to do some biological recording, do stay and have a chat with me at the end. That's definitely something that we can go over. Recommended resources. I've tried to keep this as comprehensive as possible. I know my camera isn't going to pick it up, but I'm going to show it anyway. This Collins British Common Wildflower Guide I've had since I was 18. I've had it a very long time. It's a 2015 edition. It's fantastic. It is battered and bruised, but it's just because I love it. It has absolutely everything you could need. The index is incredibly helpful, especially if you're trying to find different families. It has a nice little summary of each family, for example, and it tells you what to expect. Do not be thrown off by the scientific jargon. It's definitely worth at least a flick through. We do have several copies at the Wiltshire and Swindon Biological Record Centre, so don't be afraid to just ask if you can come down and have a look at the library, because we have a lot of different wildlife books, and our ones on flora are incredibly comprehensive. But the thing that I love most about the Wildflower Colonies book, if I was to pinpoint one thing, would be the glossary, because the glossary really breaks down the scientific jargon in a way that's not only user-friendly but informative, because it has images with it. Now, the images are diagrams, they're not photographs, but they're still just as fantastic, if not better, because they go over absolutely everything that you could possibly need to know about flowers, including the dragon heads. I don't know how well you can see it. I'm going to try and show it anyway. Yeah, right, regular heads. I'm really sorry if you're not seeing anything. Anyway, So this is definitely something I would recommend. Oh, excuse me, I feel like I'm gonna sneeze now. But we do have a couple of other resources. There are lots and lots of blogs online, but because none of them are necessarily trusted resources, they're not really something that I can recommend at this time. But there are lots of blogs online. So if you want to go and have a look at some blogs, I would definitely take the time to browse the internet and find a few that are helpful for you. But we do have some more recommended sources in general. So we have the Field Study Council, FSC, the Describing Flowers Fold Out Guide. It's very informative, but very user friendly. And because it's only like a fold out guide, it's not like an entire book. It's really easy to take with you when you're out on surveys and you just want to have a quick flick through on how you would describe a particular part of a flower when you're in the middle of nowhere with no internet. So it's definitely worth having one of those. I did want to include, because I know that it is getting that time of year where we all should be registering to vote. Go register to vote, regardless of your political stance. It's very, very important for nature. If you did want to read about where we stand as the Wildlife Trust, we do have our strategy by 2023 until 2030 that is going to impact all of us as well as our wildlife. One of them being that we would like to double the impact that we're currently having when it comes to reserves and the area of land that we are protecting to 30%, which I think is absolutely fantastic. Regardless of your political stance, it's definitely something worth researching and looking into. I'm obviously not going to digress into my own personal politics at this time. I think that's inappropriate, but I still do wholeheartedly encourage you all to go and register to vote if you haven't done so already. Then we've already covered the Collins Wildflower Guide, and the last one that I want to talk about is the Wildflower Key by Frances Rose. Now, I get quite a lot of comments and emails about this one because it seems a lot more complicated than it is. I wouldn't necessarily say it's beginner friendly, but that doesn't mean you should rule it out as a resource altogether, because if you can get your head around it, it's an incredible resource to have. The biggest piece of information I would pass on about this particular resource is that it was first published in 1981. So about the same time the original Ancient Woodland Inventory was taking place, which means that some of the Latin names and descriptions and family characteristics have changed over time. Of course they have. We're always evolving. So some of the information on the original one I would take with a pinch of salt, but there is a revised edition where they update everything and it's just as informative. So I wish we had more time for me to dive into how incredible that particular guide is. I don't have one with me at this moment. They're at the Biological Record Centre, but they have like a little ruler on the back so you can measure different size of things. Their glossary is incredibly comprehensive. They go into different families, they go into different species, it's all colorized. I think it's brilliant, but it is one that can seem a little bit intense at first viewing. I did want to quickly touch on our future training events and webinars. We're making great time, guys. So we have a couple more coming up before the Ancient Woodland Inventory Update series comes to a close, which I'm going to be really sad about because I've had such a good time doing this alongside my surveying. But we will be, as part of the Ancient Woodland Inventory Update, creating a workshop on mobile mapping. That includes everything from wildlife recording to GPS. For volunteers that have signed up on the project, it is free. Otherwise, there is a fee. This will be hosted by myself and my manager, John Isherwood, who is incredibly technical and very talented when it comes to that kind of stuff. So it will be recorded for those that do sign up but are unable to attend the day. The date, although we have put it as the 5th of the 9th, is subject to change depending on circumstances. So it is one to maybe keep penciled in, but not in permanent pen in the diary. but it is one that I'm very much looking forward to, because knowing exactly where certain archaeological features are on sites, or where a very, very rare plant is, can be crucial evidence and information when it comes to this project, but also for our county. So it is definitely something I would worth considering. Otherwise, I've got two more fun, very overview-ish, not necessarily in-depth training webinars coming up. So we will have one on chalk grassland, which will be next month. There might be a couple more wildflower species thrown into that one. And then we will go on to talking about the archaeological training element of this project, but it's also just a lot of fun if you're into archaeology, and I would love some insights. So if any of that interests you, or you want to come along, or you want to be part of it, do just let me know. Unfortunately, the pages where you can sign up aren't yet available. I haven't published them, but as soon as they become available, if you're a volunteer, you will be immediately contacted by Kinetic. Otherwise, it will be on the Wiltshire Wildlife Trust Eventbrite page. I believe that's everything. Thank you so much to everyone who has donated, and thank you so much to everyone who has taken time out of their evening to listen to me ramble on about wildflower families. It's genuinely been such a pleasure to research, to look more in depth into, and also to share that knowledge with other people, and some hints and tips and tricks that I've learned along the way that's been really helpful to me. Hopefully, if nothing else sticks, the dragon head stick. So I'm going to end the session there. Thank you so much.